In the Bible, God promises to supply our every need. Usually, though, He will supply those needs through our own efforts. Today on the Trumpet Daily, we discuss the proper balance between relying on God's strength and power and doing your own part.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
When Herbert Armstrong was talking about how he started the Plain Truth many years ago, back in the early 1930s, as you probably know about that magazine, it started in the smallest of possible ways, being rolled off a mimeograph machine, just a few copies, and then it, of course, grew and grew and grew over the course of the next 5 decades to where it went around the world to millions upon millions of people. But he just started it pretty much from scratch. This publication that went around the world. And in writing about that beginning, he said, when I was a boy, 18 years old, I read a book by Orison Swett Marden captioned, "He Can Who Thinks He Can." And Mr. Armstrong says, I had the gumption to believe that. The plain truth, like the proverbial grain of mustard seed, started the very smallest and has grown to one of the earth's largest. It started on faith with diligence and hard work and vision. So you see what God was able to do there with Mr. Armstrong at the start. And of course it was even more amazing and miraculous to think about what God could do through that man toward the end of his life as well, because of his willing attitude, because of his spirit, because of his determination to perform many wonderful and mighty works. I mean, he did not limit God. He wouldn't let anything limit the work. He just kept growing and expanding God's work, the facilities, the programs. It really is a remarkable story when you think about the innovative, ambitious attitude that he had, along with the faith that he developed later in the process, once he became converted. And speaking of those early days, of course, he also brought out how much vanity he had. He trusted in himself only. But what a combination it was when he brought God into it. And he humbled himself, and yet he still retained that ambitious desire to perform great things for God. He said, as I quoted to you there, that he had the gumption to believe what Orison Swett Marden said in his book, He Can Who Thinks He Can. And we have that book in the library here on campus, by the way, and refer to it from time to time. Marden says at the start of that essay, it's actually a collection of a number of essays that man wrote back in the early part of the 20th century. And in the one Mr. Armstrong referred to, in that quote I gave to you, Marden says, I promised my God I would do it. I promised my God I would do it. And then he continues in this essay, in September 1862, when Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the sublime act of the 19th century, he made this entry in his diary. I promised my God I would do it. I promised God I'd do it. And then Marden says, does anyone doubt that such a mighty resolution added power to this marvelous man, or that it nerved him to accomplish what he had undertaken? That helped him, in other words, that goal that he had, the promise that he made to God. He says finally, neither ridicule nor caricature, neither dread of enemies nor desertion of friends could shake his indomitable faith in his ability to lead the nation through the greatest struggle in its history. How much easier would it have been for Lincoln to just push that aside and say, well, someone else will come along and take care of that. I know it's a problem. Others before him knew it was a problem. They knew it was dividing the country. They knew it was bringing the nation down. But he stayed with it and would not let go. He didn't hand it over to someone else for someone else to take care of it. He stayed with it, as Marden brings out. I mean, you can see why he was so dogged and determined to stay the course. Because he promised God that he'd do it. And he didn't want to see his life end without fulfilling that promise, without keeping his word. It's interesting when you study some of those old materials that shaped Mr. Armstrong's life, that shaped his ministry. He doesn't refer to a lot in his autobiography and other writings and such. But the few that he does, we've tried to collect over here at the library. You know about the autobiography of Ben Franklin, Marden's book. There's a few others that he's mentioned over the years. And when you get those books and read through them, you can really see why or who Mr. Armstrong was when he was coming into his converted life. Even life before conversion, as I said, he had a supreme amount of confidence in himself. He writes about that in the autobiography. And when you read some of the self-help type books that he was interested in back as a young man, you can see why. He was really looking to himself. He was brimful of confidence. He was an ambitious man, filled with drive, wanted to be successful, wanted to make all kinds of contacts. And as we know, he had to eventually be humbled. God had to yank a lot of those things he was seeking after right out from under him to get him to put his priorities straight, to get the right set of priorities. But you know what? When Mr. Armstrong was converted, when Mr. Armstrong was humbled, even though his priorities were changed, he never did lose that innovative ingenuity. He never did lose that drive to excel, that drive to achieve. He just changed his goals. And all of a sudden, things that used to be so incredibly important to him weren't so important. And it was more important to instead obey God. In May of 1983, he wrote a personal entitled, "He Can Who Thinks He Can." He referred to this article that Marden wrote many years ago. And he said that when he saw a copy of Marden's book, around the time that Mr. Armstrong wrote that article in 1983, he was taken back to the first time that he picked up a copy of that, back in the early part of the 20th century, 1910, I think it was. And he thought about how he was as a young man. I think he would have been about 17 or 18 years of age at the time. And how, as I just described, he was just full of self-confidence. And he acknowledged in this May 1983 article that self-confidence can produce results. There's certainly something to be said for that as opposed to the just sit and do nothing approach. It can produce results, but as he says in the article, later in life I learned of a far better, more resultful confidence than self-confidence, he means. That would produce even more results, much better results than just having confidence in self. Let's look at Genesis 1 to begin with. When Mr. Armstrong was struck down by those life-changing challenges that his wife brought to him and then another relative, he really began to see God in the Bible much differently than he ever had before. Genesis 1, verse 24, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so." And then verse 26 says, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And so Mr. Armstrong got into a thorough study of the Bible. And he studied it this time with an open mind. He decided this time that he would go into it, and at first, of course, it was to disprove his wife and his relatives. But he came to find out that the Bible was actually true. In the case of the challenge from his wife, he saw that his wife was right on that Sabbath challenge. That rational study of the Bible, it revealed to him that God intended for man to have a direct relationship or connection with his Maker, with his Creator. And in that night and day study that went on for 6 months, Mr. Armstrong got to know God, and he saw that he was made in God's image and likeness, and that God meant for him to have a personal relationship with his Maker. Before that time, of course, he, like so many in this world, even to this day, he'd get ashamed or embarrassed if the subject of God came up. I mean, today, I suppose, just going by the spirit of this age, there's more of a disdain, more of a hatred for things of God. But back then, it wasn't as bad, but there still was the built-in hostility that Romans 8 speaks of, that most people had, that when the subject came up, well, we just don't want to talk about it. We want to change the subject. Let's get back to the real world. Let's get back to the job and the things that we have to do. But he changed his perspective. He realized just how silly he had been to be embarrassed about God or about the things of God. And he came to see that the Bible was, in fact, a set of very practical instructions, very practical teachings that you can use and apply. He wrote, "I was well aware that in most humans lie dormant abilities, powers, and resources, latent talents that ought to be aroused, brought out, and developed. But there is a greater source of power. There are multiplied greater resources. So," he said, "why not tap both?" He said that those self-help books didn't shock him. He was well aware of the fact that there's talents and abilities inside each one of us. But he learned in that study that he needed to tap another source of power and ability. It's interesting the way he puts it. In that 1983 article, he didn't, if you notice, he didn't just say, okay, it's trust all in yourself, or that when God opened his mind, he switched to the other extreme and said, well, just put your trust wholly in God and don't bother about doing anything yourself. It's a combination of the two. Let's look at that in James 2. Of course, we've got to put our faith and our trust in God completely, totally. But God also expects us to act on what we're learning, to act on what we know, to act on what he's teaching us. James chapter 2 and verse 14, it says, "What does it profit, my brethren, though a man say he has faith and have not works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Depart in peace, be you warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not those things which are needful to the body, what does it profit?" See, just like that example of the Good Samaritan I used in a program recently. What good does it do if we walk alongside on the other side of the road and say, well, boy, I sure hope that fellow gets to feeling better? What good does that do if we don't act on it, if we don't go across the street and help him out? That's the same thing that James is talking about here. Helping someone in time of need. Verse 17 says, "Even so, faith, if it has not works, is dead, being alone." I'm not saying that we should be on the street side, just helping anyone that comes along. I mean, the way that we help this world is by getting this message out, primarily. But notice the principle here. Even so, faith, if it has not works, is dead, being alone. Complete faith and trust in God, if it's not combined with works on our part, then it's just nothing more than dead faith. Dead faith. There are two kinds of faith in the Bible. There's the living faith of Christ in us that is active. And then there's the dead faith that you see so much of today that doesn't act, that just likes to believe good things or think good things about others. Mr. Armstrong says, why not ignite that spark within, drive oneself on to develop his own abilities, and at the same time replace self-confidence with a living faith in the direction, inspiration, wisdom, and resources of dynamic supernatural power from above. See how he's talking about the combination there? Why not ignite that spark within? Go ahead.